I have today signed an executive order providing for the establishment of a Peace Corps on a temporary pilot basis. I'm also sending to Congress a message proposing authorization of a permanent Peace Corps. This Corps will be a pool of trained men and women sent overseas by the United States government or through private institutions and organizations to help foreign countries meet their urgent needs for skilled manpower. It is our hope to have between 500 to 1,000 people in the field by the end of this year. We will send Americans abroad who are qualified to do a job. We will send those abroad who are committed to the concept which motivates the Peace Corps. It will not be easy. None of the men and women will be paid a salary. They will live at the same level as the citizens of the country which they're sent to, doing the same work, eating the same food, speaking the same language. We're going to put particular emphasis on those men and women who have skills in teaching, agriculture, and in health. I'm hopeful that it will be a source of satisfaction to Americans and a contribution to world peace.
So this is Mr. David Gardner here, and from November 1998 through June 2000, I was actually a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was in the Solomon Islands. And if we look, this is a representation of the crest or the flag, where we have the major islands in the ocean, we got the beach, and then we got the rainforest. And so the Solomon Islands, if you've never heard of them, is actually northeast of Australia. It's a series of many, many islands. Some are really, really tiny. Some are a little bit longer, but basically all of them are a lot smaller than, like Long Island in New York State, just to give you a relative example. And so I lived on Santa Isabel Province, which was northwest of the capital of Honiara, where you see that little other red dot next to the red arrow. So the crest of the Solomon Islands is a great representation of the things and wildlife and some of the history that has gone in there. And I find it ironic that part of their crest is to lead is to serve, as I was serving as a Peace Corps volunteer. And every time we would go out snorkeling when we were on the reef, we would actually see sharks. Fortunately, we never saw any of the crocodiles because the saltwater crocodiles, of course, could be nasty. And a Wantok right here, as we see, is basically someone that's from your area. It's kind of like one talk, people that are your relatives and your locals. And so they are your community people that have the same language as you. And so when we first arrived, there were 38 of us, 16 married couples, and 6 singles, which is kind of ironic because most Peace Corps volunteers are actually single right out of college and things like that. But because the Solomon Islands is so remote, they actually sent a lot of married couples. And there I was over in the top. And my nice, not a beard, but that's a little goatee there. And so when we first arrived in the country, it was late at night through Hawaii and through Fiji and Vanuatu, and we finally made it in. And when we first came in, you have a lot of cultural training and language training. And so here we are. This is a former Peace Corps volunteer. This is JJ. He was here to give us some of the training and just to welcome us in like a regular, native bushman from many, many years ago. And so we also experienced some of the cultural events and some of the panpipers. They would have bamboo panpipers, and they had performers for us when we actually showed up. And we had the ability to meet them first off. And there I am in the top left. And I find it ironic, our country director, Wes, way over here on the left, was actually a Japanese American. And if you're familiar with some of the World War II history, the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal was a huge front in the war between Japan and the U.S. So it's great that we have that camaraderie with other countries around the world right now. And there's a huge front. One of the interesting things, if you think back to the beginning of this video, that was our president back in the day when Peace Corps was initiated in 1961, when it was JFK, John F. Kennedy Jr., and he ironically was not a Peace Corps volunteer. He was a World War II vet over in the Solomon Islands. And ironically, both my grandfather and uncle also served in the Solomon Islands. Now, they never met JFK over there, but my grandfather came home safely. My uncle disappeared. His plane was, basically went out for a flight, never came back. And we'll see some of the footage of some of those, deposits and materials and machinery that's left over in some of these slides. And so one of the goals of the Peace Corps, of course, is to help others help themselves. We are going to teach them things that they can then teach their relatives and their community and their villages. And then the other parts are, to me, learning their customs and bringing it back to the U.S., but also me bringing some of my customs and information and knowledge to the Solomon Islands, because a lot of people think that maybe all people from the United States are rich and predominantly white. And on the other end, we think that a lot of people living in countries like this are living in grass huts and running around with just grass skirts. And it's not always the case. Okay, and that's true around the world, that there's a lot of things that we don't really understand. And so here we are building charcoal stoves because there's a lot of materials in the Solomon Islands, like coconuts, that can be wasted. And so when you have that coconut shell or the bowl, maybe it fills with water, and that ends up being a breeding ground for mosquitoes. But instead, if you can take the bowl and the husk and that fibrous material, now we can use it as an energy source to cook food with, instead of to actually cut down trees. And so we don't have deforestation over in the tropics. And so if you notice here in the top left, we actually have a lot of fast-growing bamboo in the Solomon Islands. And the kids, because they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the resources, they had to entertain themselves a lot. And they were actually making a drum set just by cutting different sections of the bamboo out. They were making drums here for their actual enjoyment. And notice the hair on this young boy. His name was Selsun, kind of like the shampoo Selsun Blue. But I always found it amazing with the people in the country of the Solomon Islands, how they had such blonde hair, where for many years they thought it was because of the missionaries and German ancestry that came over. But then, through some genealogically testing, they figured out that it was actually, a genetic, change and a genetic mutation that really actually occurred and caused this blonde hair, to have the ability to show up and appear in the people of this region, which is always amazing. And here I am actually scratching coconut to make, coconut milk and to have coconut, oil and other things like that, which is, again, one of the things they would do over in that country. They actually produce coconut oil. Maybe if you look in your coconut oil, you'll find that it's from the Solomon Islands. When we first got there, we actually did, a couple months of training, and I spent a good month living in this 2-story leaf and stick house. It was awesome. And one of the mornings, if you see, it's all just on, posts, I actually felt it shaking, and I thought I was living in a dream. But in reality, when I got to the school session for training that morning, we all basically had that same experience. It was a 5.1 earthquake. And so there's not very much structural sound to this. And so the whole thing was shaking. Fortunately, it didn't fall over, but it was a nice size earthquake for that environment. They trained us when we were over there to try to survive in case we were in a certain area where maybe we didn't have material. So here we are trying to set fire by friction. Notice we see the coconut shells and husks in the bottom, where that we could then start to get things to smolder and then to possibly start to survive if we needed to, if something happened to us, out in the wild. As I mentioned before, the kids like to entertain themselves. And so here they are, they just made some coconut boats. They're floating out. Notice the pristine waters. We have maybe with the remnants of a burnt down coconut tree or, palm tree that's left over, and they're just having a good time enjoying life. And so people are always wondering, is something like this, when we go, where do we, possibly hang out? Where do we go when we're needing to use the services, right? And so this is actually my toilet in this village. And notice there's certain materials missing. In the top left, you can kind of see and picture out the remnants of a 50-gallon drum. And this would just be a bucket flush. And so instead of having the tank, and you can do this at your own house with your own toilet, just take a bucket of water and pour it down and your toilet flushes because of the traps that are inside and underneath. And so as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's a lot of World War II relics and remnants that are left over. And so this was at one of the resorts that we went to hang out around Christmas time, and there's remnants all over. When the U.S. left, a lot of the machinery and materials and, things that were destroyed were just left there, which is somewhat unfortunate, but at the same time, they couldn't clean it up. They didn't really have the ability to bring it back with them when they left. And so we went through and experienced different places. And one of the places we spent some time at was one of the community schools. And so I actually ended up teaching at a public, not a public, but like a boarding school. But this community here was actually a community school. So the kids lived around it a little bit more, full time. And they did things like beekeeping. They were trying to, again, raise money that they could use for other food for the school, or maybe they could buy more clothing to create more, school uniforms and things like that. Or they just wanted the honey to eat, of course, to add to their diet. And so the language over there was called Pidgin, and it's like a backwards broken English, kind of like a Pig Latin. So if you look at this and read it, wash them hand with them soap and water, you can kind of read just that it says wash your hands with soap and water. So a lot of it was the same, and a lot of that's the influence of Britain being, over there for many, many years because it was a British Commonwealth. They are a free country now, but again, we have that influence of English in with the language. Now, every country around there might have a different language, but a lot of them are tied in and a lot of them are close and similar. Like Vanuatu has a Pidgin English as well that is very similar. But even within the islands, they had their own little dialects that could have been very different. Just because they were separated by great distances, unless you had a boat, then you might be relatively close. And so when I went out to my school, this was my actual house. Again, it's not a leaf and stick. I do have a leaf and stick front porch or veranda, but I had a masonite wall, basically permanent. I had a tin roof. I have gutters. I have a rain tank, which we'll see in the next pictures here. And notice it's on stilts to keep the airflow going because I don't have air conditioning. I don't have, heat. It was in the tropics. And so the inside, I had very minimal materials. I have a food safe here. We can see to the left of the table. It's screened in because in my first 6 months, I actually killed 9 mice because I must have had a family of mice living in there, and I kept, trapping them and killing them. And so you need to protect your food. I don't have any refrigeration. And so all the food that I had to bring must have been perishable or non-perishable items. And, if it was perishable, I had to eat it fast. But if it was non-perishable, I wanted to keep it locked up in a safe or have it packaged appropriately. So a lot of bags of rice, a lot of canned tuna fish, canned vegetables, ramen noodles, cans of Nutella. That's where I learned about Nutella and, biscuits and things like that. So very minimal. If you notice the inside of my bedroom, I don't have finished walls. I had a lot of place to, hang knickknacks or put stuff, but I had a mosquito net. And if you notice, there's a little sheet over the top of it. When I first got there, I had my bed arranged a different way, and I thought that I was, maybe having a leaking roof. And my roof also was very, dingy, and, I really didn't have a ceiling, and it was just, the insulate, basically like a thin layer of insulation, basically a sheet on top of it that had been rotted away over the years. And I thought my roof was leaking, but instead it was the actual geckos that were peeing, and it was ending up hitting down in my bed and splattering on me. So I got smart and put the sheet over the bed. Things you learn as a Peace Corps volunteer. And so this one looks a little more familiar, but this is my toilet and my bathroom at my house. Now, again, notice there is no tank, but in this case, you can see the bucket of water that I would use to bucket flush. For 2 years out there, because the floorboards underneath were kind of rotten, I never sat down. You learn how to squat. So it makes you appreciate the things that you have back in the United States about being able to sit down and use the bathroom. My shower was actually outside. I didn't have any running water in my house, but we did have running water basically that was gravity fed outside. And the problem was, because I lived at the top of the hill, I often didn't get water because the students that lived at the bottom of the hill would often leave the water running. In this case, the kids would turn the water on. They'd come and they would do some work, maybe at my house, and they would ask to get a drink or use the faucet to clean up. I say, go ahead. But then if the water didn't come, they would forget to turn the water off. And so sometimes in the middle of the night, I'd hear this water just pouring out, so I'd have to get up. But one thing I want to point out is all this white stuff around. That's what they would call gravel or coral. It's old coral reef that had basically washed up to the shore. And the kids would actually go, maybe a good mile or so and walk down to the beach and grab that to make the area a little more, appealing. But it also removed a lot of the mud that would have been around this. And, that concrete block at the bottom wouldn't get as slimy because of this. Now, if you think about school in the United States, if you get in trouble, you end up maybe having to do a teacher detention. Over there, instead of just sitting in a room and, sulking and, doing some work on a paper or on the chalkboard or on, a computer, laptop, whatever you're doing these days, these kids actually had to do some physical labor. So they might have to go grab 2 bags of this coral, which could be heavy and have to carry it and do manual labor. The kids actually ran the school because they didn't have a janitorial staff. The kids actually did work line, and they all had different duties after school because they helped run the boarding school. And so we see more of this gravel here, which is right above my water tank. And my water tank, there was time where the posts started to rot. And so I actually had kids build me new posts. We took all the water out. We emptied it. Never had fear of really running out of water because it rained all the time every day. And, there was always a good hour break, an hour of rain, a day at least. Maybe there was a couple days without any, but pretty much it rained every day. I never had to worry about water running out, so kids would always come and use the water. But again, I didn't want it to collapse on anyone. And anytime it flowed and overflowed, you ended up getting a little erosion take place. And so we see this path of coral that helped to fill in and provide a better drainage. Excuse me. Now, this is not a war relic, but the school that I taught at, it was a boarding school. The first time we went out to my site, it took 31 hours by boat to get there because we had to stop at every single little village, and it took a long time to get there from the capital. And it used to be an old logging camp. And so this is one of the logging materials you see in the back that was left over. So after some major cyclones knocked down a lot of the major, and the big trees, they didn't feel that they had what was left anymore that was worthwhile. So they just left the camp there. But because they had an existing road, because they had some existing buildings, they turned it into a school. And because of that logging that continued, a lot of the trees were removed. And what happens when you move a lot of the trees and the roots die off, you don't have a lot of the materials to hold in the grasses and to hold in the soil. And so there's a lot of erosion that takes place. And you get a lot of red clay that exists underneath, which unfortunately is not very good to grow. And so the kids had to go farther into the woods and into the forest to actually have some gardens. And so we see, as we look, heading down from my hill, from my house, and you see, again, all this red clay all over the place. And, again, the buildings are permanent. They're what's like a masonite. It's kind of like a thicker type of a sheetrock. Metal roof. We do have some buildings that do have a leaf and stick roof. And one of the big differences when you're trying to teach there, if you have a metal roof and it was starting to pour, you couldn't teach. You could not hear yourself. You couldn't hear what the kids were saying. So basically you had to stop or just put stuff up on the chalkboard versus actually teaching. If you were teaching in a leaf and stick room, totally different. It was a lot softer on that environment. And so again, beautiful scenario, beautiful area just in the middle of the tropics. And as we go through, this is looking from the other angle. And so if we went down the hill and up through the school and up to the other side, the other volunteer, my buddy Kevin, lived on the other side. So we had 2 Peace Corps volunteers there. And then after his first year, he left because his service was done. And then a new volunteer came in. Her name was Armel. They finally brought a female there. They always thought it was too remote. And, we kind of talked him in and said that, it's okay that the female students at the school would really appreciate having a female volunteer versus just all these male volunteers and other male teachers, just to show that the females can do anything here. And so if you notice, there's a dog. There's a lot of wild dogs there. Some kind of trying to adopt us, and some were, belonging to some of the families there. But the school had over 300 kids, and there was about 14 teachers. And so this picture I'm always amazed at because, we kind of wonder, like, what the heck are they doing? And so what this is actually a picture that was taken after the Christmas break. So Christmas break would always be long. And the school system in the Solomon Islands runs from January through, late December. But there was often, issues where the boat would start and run late, or maybe, school would end early because of sickness or disease, or we ran out of food or ran out of money. Those are all scenarios that I experienced when I was there. And so when we came back, there was a lot of overgrowth. And what these kids are actually doing are actually cleaning their soccer field with machetes. Now, unlike in the United States where, if a kid brought a knife to school, you'd actually have, they'd be on possible lockdown, and, the kid would get suspended or maybe even expelled, and there'd be other investigations, so on and so forth. Where in the Solomon Islands, it's basically a requirement to bring a machete. Notice they all have it because, again, this is their major tool to run their lives. Okay, they're cutting the grass with this. They're going to open up coconuts with this. They're going to cut down trees for firewood with this. If they kill and they, go hunting, or if they go fishing, they're going to, take care and prepare the animals with this that they're going to actually eat. And so again, we can see the soccer post over here on the right side, but they're all carrying very big knives because they teach them how to use it appropriately. Okay, it's a survival tool. It's not necessarily a weapon. Technically, it can be used as a weapon. And we had rumors where, people did get hit with them because, someone was angry at someone else and someone hit someone in the head, in the shoulder, or the neck, or, wherever. And fortunately, I wasn't there when anyone was killed. But again, that could be a scenario where it would happen. But they teach them from the time they're, a baby to use a knife. And so if we notice in the previous picture, the kids were doing the work line. Okay, they were preparing their soccer field so they could use it because we would have, games in the afternoon on Fridays. And so notice here, they're all going to chapel. The Solomon Islands was basically a church-run country, And a lot of them spoke English because, again, of the British ancestry and the British rule over there for a while. But a lot of them didn't. If they were living in the village, they might not have. And in this case, we have a ceremony. This is the Form 3 and Form 5, graduation or moving up ceremonies. And in this case, they would all dress up in uniforms. Now, the kids did not typically wear uniforms daily, mostly because they couldn't afford them. They might have to borrow them or trade and change just for these events. But a lot of students didn't have the money to do this. And some kids didn't go to school on time until they could actually have the money to be afforded that. And so this is the Form 5 girls. Here I am with, pretty much I pop out there. You can see me there down at the bottom, pretty easy, huh? But again, this is with the Form 5 classes. These are all, again, dressed up. This is their graduation ceremony. But typically they might not actually wear the uniform. They might just wear regular t-shirts and shorts. The girls would wear skirts because of their customs. And again, but typically it was t-shirts. And I guess I get humored by this picture all the time, but this is their graduation ceremony. They got their little moving up diplomas. At least they can use their diplomas for blocking out the sun. Now notice they're using umbrellas because a lot of times in these countries you want to keep away from the heat. They don't want to stay out in the middle of the sun. And so again, this is just a temporary setup, for this ceremony. And so in addition to teaching, I don't want to get into the boring stuff about teaching, but I did teach science. I did teach math when I was over there. And I also did some side projects. And so one of the side projects I did was on the leatherback turtle and teaching them about this awesome, amazing, endangered creature that actually would come and lay their eggs and nest about, a 25-minute walk from the actual school. So we would go out at night a couple times during the nesting season. We would actually experience how much the turtle actually went through to actually get their eggs to be laid. And as you can see on the left and the right of the turtle, it looks like an amazing pattern of a tire. And the problem was the kids would used to, and the people from the country would go the next day or during daylight, and they would take a stick and they would poke it into the sand. And as they poked it in the sand, they would look for the bottom. If it came up gooey, kind of like if you were to take a toothpick and put it into a cake and pull out and recognize if your cake is ready or not, or messy or gooey or not, and still cooked, they would figure out whether or not it was a true nest or a fake nest. And if there was a true nest, they might see the goo and they would see the eggs there. They would dig up the eggs and eat them. So unfortunately, there could be a problem where the numbers of turtles start to diminish. So this turtle could be 30 to 50 years old. Maybe this turtle was born before the school even existed. And then it always comes back to its own place where it was born to actually lay its own eggs. And so if all of a sudden they're taking all the eggs, maybe 30 years from now, there's not going to be any turtles left. So it was my goal to try to educate them to not eat all the turtle eggs. And even around the Solomon Islands, we would see posters like this where it says, Oketa toteli no staka now, hem tembu fokilim toteli, faselim, and fatekim every egg blong oketa. Basically, that says all the turtles are not in big stock now. It's taboo to kill the turtles for sell and for taking every eggs of the turtles. They are endangered and they're protected, but the problem is there's not a lot of people to protect them and to actually serve and to actually find people if they were to catch them to do that. And so this is, just for reference, this is my size 11 Chuck Taylor sneaker. We went out for a canoe ride. We were going to go snorkeling. And when we got to the island, we found this shell. Okay, the turtle had already been killed. Someone had already eaten it. And this was the shell that was left over. So I just brought it back again as an educational tool to try to teach them. My goal as a Peace Corps volunteer is not to change their customs and their cultures, but is to try to educate so that things can last a lot longer so they don't use it all up. And so some of the other projects that I worked on as a volunteer were the library and the multipurpose sports court. And so the library looked like a cyclone had come through it. They had it as an office. The previous principal and the previous buildings were kind of run down. But the time I got there, we had a new principal. He was a wonderful man, and he started to put money back into the school instead of using it for himself and sending it to his family. And so they actually put money in, and they took, instead of the teacher's office being in here, where they were using a Gestetner machine, which is an old style copy machine where you actually would type up a stencil and you would use ink and you would hand crank the actual prints. And so the ink copies would be all over the place. They were messing up books. And if you notice, the walls are dingy and kind of run down, books all over, the bookcases are kind of run down. And, you can see over in the bottom right corner, There's one of the bookends. And so what we did was we kind of freshened it up and we organized it so that the kids could actually use it again. We took all the bookends, we painted the bookshelves, we painted the walls, and I had some student volunteers, paint. Basically, we did a very simple Dewey Decimal System or organizational system, just based, I think we might have done it by author or maybe book title. And so we just organized the books. We had a student paint, the school crest that we hung on the door. And the kids took pride in working for this. So Skills for Life. Allardyce was the school, and Allardyce Provincial Secondary School, that was the school that I taught at. And we have our little frigate birds up there at the top of the Solomon Islands, the Isabel frigates. That was their main, animal. And so notice over here, just to the left of my face, there's that Solomon Islands turtle poster. And, we see the books, and the kids actually, we had some educational posters on some native island animals. And I find it ironic that, one of the animals that is native to the Solomons is the Solomon skink. And it's kind of like a lizard, or not kind of like, it actually is a lizard. And they actually have a Solomon skink in the Rosamond Gifford Zoo where I live in Syracuse, New York, which I think is kind of amazing. And so the kids brought in, enjoyment into the building and into the school. And notice in the back of the wall, the walls have been painted again. So we brightened it up, and we hired kids to, train kids how to actually turn the pages in a book appropriately, how to carry them and how to protect them and keep them out of the rain. And actually, they enjoyed the library, and they opened it up, and they could start educating themselves again and on their own time. And so that was the first project. The second project I worked on was the sports court. This was one, again, the previous principal. There was money that was provided, and they kind of, took the money and they started the project, but then they didn't take all the money and they, put it into the services. So if you notice here on the bottom left and over in the bottom right, there's all this like overgrowth and algae and slime and stuff. And so we cleaned it all up. We made drains around it. And we brushed it all off. And the kids, again, took some ownership into this, and they painted it. And, that was a giant mosquito carrying away basketball. We got the hoops put up, and we got the lines painted for both basketball and netball. And they painted the school symbol there, of course, Allardyce Secondary School. And again, the kids enjoyed doing it as part of their work line, right? And then they were able to enjoy it and play sports. They played basketball and netball on it. And so, while I was teaching and while I was doing these secondary projects, I still had a lot of free time. Okay, I had a ton of it, actually. I would teach, a few blocks a day, basically 3 out of the 4 blocks. And then, I basically had my evenings free if I wasn't on duty, and, making sure and monitoring the kids were in order and doing the right things. And so I learned guitar a little bit. Notice at the bottom of the guitar, there's that wash your hands with soap and water sticker. And, in the background, you can see my Chuck Taylor. I would go snorkeling and fishing with my buddy Kevin, and even, with Armel and whoever wanted to go, we would go on the reef all the time. I would collect carvings. I earned a salary as a Peace Corps volunteer that was equivalent to what a teacher would earn. Now, Peace Corps volunteers, again, don't really earn a salary per se, but I did earn a living allowance. And what I earned when I was over there was basically, if I rounded up, it was about $900 Solomon per month. And so if we divide that on your average month of 30 days, I'm making about 30 Solomon dollars a day, which if you converted that to the exchange rate at that time was 5 to 1, I was making $6 a day. Okay, I was being paid $6 a day. But what I would do is I would take that salary and I would buy a month's worth of food, but I would be at my site for 3 months, and I actually, not a month's worth of food, 3 months worth of food, and I could let that last. And so I ended up having some extra funds, and so I invested back into some of the great artwork of the Solomon Islands. So the carvings, and at the bottom left we have what's called a nusu nusu. The one on the left is holding the head, the one on the right is holding a dove. And what they would often be is on the ends of war canoes or just regular canoes. If the nusu nusu had a head, that means they were coming for head hunting, they were coming for war. Maybe they were coming to try to take someone, maybe they were trying to take a bride or something. The ones on the bottom, or the one with the dove, that meant they were coming for peace. Maybe they were coming for a bride as well, but maybe they were coming to exchange a bride price, and maybe they were coming to exchange and buy crops or buy materials. Okay, so there's a lot of good carvings that I bought there. And again, here we see a stone nusu nusu on the top left. We see a manta ray. We see some dolphins and sharks and turtles. And we see one of their mythical creatures again, and one of their gods of, fishing and life and so on and so forth. And so, again, a lot of cool stuff that I was able to bring home and send home and give as gifts to people. I mentioned the war in the beginning of this video. This is a great World War II monument that took place, again, that I was able to visit, which is great because, again, my uncle and grandfather both served there. The money I actually collected as artwork because, again, it was colorful. The money in the United States has gotten a little better, but it was always bland and green. And so here we see the crest again with the shark and the alligator, crocodile, and some of the other materials and the shell money, okay? I collected stamps when I was over there, and I would always send them to people to see the different ones. So again, it was a 5-to-1 exchange rate when I was there. So really this is about a 40-cent purchase, but it cost about $1 to send. At that point, it was about a $5 Solomon stamp or $1 basically to send a letter home to the United States. The mail home to the United States would usually get there pretty quick. Sometimes I might not get stuff for months if it came from the US. And so I was there for the turn of the century. We actually rented an island, myself and 3 other couples. And one of the coolest things that we had there was bioluminescent zooplankton, phytoplankton floating around in the water. And that was one of the most amazing experiences, diving in the water and just seeing it all light up as we did this and kind of hung out for the turn of the century. The education is also on their stamps. I mentioned, the turtles, and right here we have a series of the life cycle of just a turtle in the Solomon Islands. And so this picture, and unfortunately, it's not in great quality, but notice again the size of a normal pen. That is a centipede. Think about the centipedes you might see in your basement in the United States. They're about maybe the size of the pen cap. This one could cause extreme damage. It possibly could kill an infant, or it would cause, that body part that got stung to be hurting for, a week or so. And so they had these. This one was actually, I found on the front porch. But one day I was actually sitting talking to one of the other volunteers in my house, and I actually hear this little pitter patter. And I look over on the bench that I'm sitting at, and one was actually coming right at me. So I literally got up, grabbed my machete, cut it in half. And if you've ever played the game Centipede, how when you cut it in half and both parts start going, that's exactly what happened. But, fortunately I was able to kill it. I was safe the whole time. I was never bitten by one of these. However, they did have these like bullet stinging ants sometimes in the bush and going through the grasses. Those things basically felt like a nail was just going in you. I had fire ants in my bed sometimes, and those things would make you itch. But I was relatively safe the whole time I was there. This was a cool guy I saw, my buddy Kevin's house. You would find, you would hear them all over the place, but you could never find them. Frogs are great. They do a great job of camouflaging themselves. And so we turned around one night. I was hanging out having dinner at Kevin's house. I turned around and he's literally on the wall. And so when we went and took him out, we put him in our hand. We thought he was just going to step into the branch. No, he jumped up to the branch. It was kind of cool to see this tree frog inside the house. I took a lot of pictures, as you can tell. This is just a small representation of all my pictures. I took well over 30 rolls. I would send them home to the United States. My dad would develop them and send me the doubles so I could share them with the kids over there. But of all my pictures, this one is my absolute favorite, okay? It was a sunset. I was out at a walkabout with one of the other volunteers, Hans, right when I first got there. And this was one of my favorite pictures. There's a lot of great sunset pictures. This was actually a sunset off my porch from my school. So you can see, you can kind of picture the ocean way in the distance. And again, we always had these nice sunsets, but the sunsets were really quick there. Here's one from the yacht club. We would go into the Capitol every 3 months and we would get, cold beverages and maybe have a beer and have some hamburgers. We'd actually have, some good kind of American food. And you would feel that cold beverage just go all the way down your throat after not feeling a cold beverage for months. Because again, no refrigeration where I was. And so we also took and participated in a sports carnival. And one of the amazing things that happens again over there, if you're not careful, a lot of people cook with propane tanks. And so this is one of the things where all of a sudden everyone started running over, to this house. And because, fortunately everyone got out, no one was hurt to my knowledge. But unfortunately, they left something cooking in their house, went into flames. Out when we were walking about 40 minutes from our school was this amazing waterfall. The kids would climb up it, they'd slide down it, and you'd get nice and cool and refreshing. It was very cool up there, but then, of course, you'd get all sweaty by the time you got back to school, wishing that this was right at the school again. And so in my free time, again, like I said, we went snorkeling and swimming, and we had some amazing things. Here we have spiny urchins. And, electric blue starfish, some crazy things that were out there. We would always see amazing things when we went out snorkeling. And, even if I wasn't snorkeling, we might come just for a walkabout, we might go running at the beach. And this is where I mentioned earlier where the kids would get the gravel which basically had just washed up old coral that had washed up over the years. And they would come and they'd hang out and they'd play cards, they'd get coconuts, they'd fish, they'd have a campfire, they would just chill on the weekend, okay? And so we did fish a lot. And so here I am on the right, my buddy Kevin on the left. You can tell what happens to Peace Corps volunteers when they're stuck out in the middle of the rainforest. They don't get haircuts often. And so this time we normally would go spear fishing, and we went outside the reef with a buddy of ours who had a motorized fiberglass canoe, and he took us, and we didn't even use any bait. We just used a line with a shiny lure. Kevin caught the barracuda on the left, and literally while he was clubbing it to death, I grabbed the line and I caught this, snapper on the right, and he was kind of jealous because I had a bigger, fatter fish. And so he threw the line in, and literally about a minute later, he caught that bigger barracuda. So this is kind of the before picture of the barracudas, and this is the after picture of the barracudas. This is one of our best meals here. This is a barracuda steak. And one of the other meals we had there was one of the best ones. We went for a night dive and caught lobsters at night. And so we had lobsters with, pasta and Alfredo sauce for breakfast one morning. Because again, no refrigeration. So of all those, fish and materials that we caught, we would often share them with the people that brought us there, because again, we could only eat so much in a first day, but we would share them with the families, and they would share them with their kids and their relatives and their wontoks, like I mentioned earlier. And so oftentimes, like I said, it took us 31 hours to get to my site by boat the first time, but sometimes we'd have the ability to fly. And in this case, I was able to fly, and I would get back to my site, or from my site to the school. I might have to take a motorboat and kind of like that fiberglass canoe, and go about an hour or two to another island, and then we could fly in. And that whole trip might take 2 or 3 hours versus 31 hours. And so they had these little puddle jumping smaller planes that if you think about it as you're landing, if you didn't land right, you're going to end up in the ocean. If you've ever traveled to countries like that, you know what I'm talking about. And so at school, the kids would have Friday night cultural events, or during holidays they would have the ability to dress up and show some of the cultures and customs for their own provinces, because the school that I taught at actually had kids that came from all over the country. Now, unlike, if you're in the United States, maybe you have an elementary school that then feeds into a middle school that then feeds into a high school. Those kids are all in the same environment. They're all in the same town and all in the same community. It doesn't work that way in the Solomon Islands. A lot of it was based on testing scores. It might be based on funds. It might be based on money, and it might be based on what they were going to study. And so they might be in a different province, and then they had to take a boat to the capital and then take another boat to Allardyce. So again, a lot of different things that take place here. So they would express different cultures and customs. We were still never wondered, what these guys were coming up with, and figured out how their customs were covering with mud. But the kids had a good time doing it. And as I mentioned a little while ago, we took part in a sports carnival. Now, one of the things I want to point out, the kids love playing sports, but notice they're not all wearing appropriate attire. Some will have cleats and shin guards. Some are just playing barefoot. Some might try to wear cleats the first half, but if they've never worn shoes, then all of a sudden their feet start to blister and hurt, and then someone else will be wearing those same cleats in the second half. But a lot of times they did it barefoot. And so here are the girls, bare feet, again, playing netball. Now you can see, if you look at, they're all looking up, there's a ball, there's a rim. What's missing is the backboard. So basically netball is kind of like, basketball with no backboard. And it's the same idea. It is an Olympic sport. The U.S., typically doesn't promote it as much, but it is an Olympic sport and played by, people from a lot of other countries. And so the girls typically played this. The boys would often play basketball. They loved playing volleyball. So we had a volleyball net set up at school. Again, at sports day, Friday afternoons, we just had a day to relax. They didn't have to do work line. But during the week, they did work line to make sure that the school was kept up appropriately. Now, I actually brought over some lacrosse sticks with me and introduced. I've been coaching lacrosse for many years. I'd always played it. And so I brought that game over and introduced the people of the Solomon Islands and the school to it. So they just thought it was crazy. And my dad actually sent a video of one of the championship lacrosse games, and they just loved how people were getting hit with it and beating each other, people falling. They just thought it was crazy. Coconuts. I want to point this out. The kids would come and do work, or if the kids would just say, mister, can I take a coconut? And I say, yeah, there was one rule. If you took a coconut from my tree, the only rule was you had to get me one and prepare one for me. And so, coconut water was awesome to drink. It was great. It was a great electrolyte and, good fuel replenishment and water replenishment for your body, because I was sweating all the time. I was drinking all the time. My electrolyte balance was off over there. I started to have certain heart condition and basically what's called preatrial contractions, or my heart would beat erratically. And a lot of it was because of my electrolyte imbalance. That's what we kind of figured out after I ended up leaving. And so the one thing I want to point out, notice again the machete. I don't know if it was this case, or I think it was this time, maybe it was another time. The student wasn't paying attention. He cut into the machete, but also took off a big chunk of his thumb. And this is what's one of the important things about, taking care of your environment and taking care and knowing what's actually out there in the real world. As we go and we start to destroy other things and we, cut down a lot of trees, we don't know the materials that are out there that exist that can help people in the world. So as his thumb was gushing blood, his buddy went over to the bush, grabbed a couple leaves, crumpled them all up so that, the juices of the leaves came out. His buddy put it on the thumb and instantly it coagulated. It stopped bleeding. Okay. And so rainforest medicine is crucial because, again, there's a lot of natural remedies that are out there. There's a lot of electrolytes and materials in the coconut, the oils in the coconut, again, beneficial to cook and to use and to eat. And again, there's all these things that are out there. And if we continue to destroy, or they continue to destroy their environments, then that presents a problem. So again, educating people on proper maintenance of their environment is an important thing to help maybe future materials and future things grow, and the survival of future people as well. And so, as I mentioned before, you're kind of out there in the middle of nowhere. And so when I first got there, again, this is around November 1998. When I first got there, I had a goatee. My hair is kind of short. It's kind of tight on the sides because it was sweating and kind of stuck to my head. But 7-8 months later, we get together for our 6-month training. It's grown. I haven't cut it. And then this is, a few months after that. And then finally, this is a year in. Okay, this was an amazing experience because I got to have basically a massage on the head for a good, few hours. Now, if you think about the type of students, the type of the hair, the genetics of the hair, their hair could be braided easily and it kind of would stay together. They wouldn't have to hold it together. Right here, they loved my hair. It was so soft. They said, one of the girls was like, "Mister, I covet your hair." And because again, they could brush it and they could braid it. And so it was like a nice little massage there. All right. So again, we're kind of coming to the closing here, and I have a couple other, more promotional materials just to show you some of the things you may have seen. But one of the things that I kind of live on, and, if I think about something, I try to do it if I really am passionate about it. And I want to really have my, unofficial end of this video here with the idea that never have to start your sentences with "I should have." Okay. That's a poster here that's put out by the Peace Corps. If you have a dream, if you have a desire, if you have a passion to do something, go out and do it. Experience it. Experience it. Don't have regrets down the road. If you have the ability, go do this. Maybe you figure out a year and it's not for you, but you went and you did it. Okay. If you have any questions, comments, thought, just leave them below, depending on where you're seeing this, or come visit me and talk to me. All right. I'd be always glad to help you out. And so just want to pop up a couple other things here that I've seen. They're kind of hard to read, so I'll read them for you. And basically it says the most difficult challenge is leaving. Again, once you've been to a place, it's hard to leave. I left for personal reasons. My health was more important. I had been there just under 2 years. I didn't necessarily have the full 2 years in, but the irony is about a week after I left, the whole country was pulled anyways. The Solomon Islands was actually under civil war and still has some ethnic tension going on almost 20 years later. The Peace Corps volunteers were never harmed in the way. They really liked us, and we were safe, but there was issues in the capital. And so it is hard to leave, but it's also, enjoyable, and it's difficult when you come back a little bit. So, the next one, still asking what you can do for your country. Okay. This one, your parents made a better life for someone else. Now it's your turn, right? This one says your daily work will be anything but a chore, right? And so the difference between a career and a purpose is about 8,000 miles. What can you do? Where are you willing to go? Are you willing to go across the street to help a neighbor? Or are you willing to go across the world to help out someone as well? It says the corner office can wait. Some corners of the world can't. One on the left, funny how someone you've yet to meet can teach you a lot about who you are. Then it says, where do you go when you desire to help, or when your desire to help is larger than your zip code? All right, there's a lot out there in the world. It says what happens in Botswana doesn't stay in Botswana, right? Kind of like the joke on what happens in Vegas, right? So from here, you can see the future. Again, what are you willing to do with your life? Think local, act global. And this one says, you may be a student, but you'll have plenty to teach. Okay? There's a lot that you can learn from other people around the world, and a lot that they can learn from you. And I like this one as well, as not seen on TV. And then fill your gaps the geography class missed. All right, there's a lot out there that you don't learn about. There's a lot out there that's going on these days that you've never been accustomed to, never been welcome to, never been familiar with, and you could make a difference. All right, take some chances, take a risk, go out there, get out of your element. When I teach this and I talk about this every year to my students during Peace Corps Week, at some points, it doesn't really matter what they learn as far as biology or chemistry or science. I want them to get out of their element. I want them to get into the different parts of the world, and I want them to experience things and see that, the bubble that they live in is not the end all. Okay, get out there and experience the world and see what you can do in it and see what part and what role you can play. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Again, if you have any questions about the Peace Corps, feel free to reach out and ask me. I'd be glad to talk to you about it. All right, we'll talk here. This has been Mr. David Gardner.